To our second webinar for this year's Texas Academy for Marine Policy series. I am Alyssa Schultz, and I'm the graduate director and host for this program. So the aim of this webinar series is to build off of the foundation laid from last year's series, where we learned a lot about the local and federal government structure and processes, the role of science in policy as well as for policy, and how to communicate science in the policy sphere. If you've missed any of these talks, you can find past webinar videos, including Chad McGuire's talk covering a scoping introduction to ocean policy and governance a couple weeks ago on the Texas Sea Grant YouTube channel, which is embedded on the TAMP webpage. This year's webinar series revolves around ocean governance, policy, and regulatory bodies. And today we have a great speaker, Dr. Tammy Adams, who will go over NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, and the intersection of science and environmental compliance. If you have any questions or thoughts during the talk, please feel free to put them into the Q&A function or hang on to them at the end, where we'll have about 10 to 15 minutes with our speaker for questions following the talk. So with that, let's meet today's speaker. Dr. Tammy C. Adams, she, her, is the NEPA coordinator for NOAA's Office of Oceanic and Atmospheric Research. Dr. Adams has over 20 years of experience at NOAA facilitating compliance of federal research, permitting, and grants programs with federal laws for environmental protection. Dr. Adams develops policy and guidance and provides training and resources to assist federal decision makers with compliance in laboratories and program offices nationwide. She has a PhD in wildlife and fisheries science from Texas A&M University, a BA in biology from Bryn Mawr College, and completed master's level core courses in oceanography at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Dr. Adams also holds a certificate in environmental collaboration and conflict resolution from the National Center for Environmental Conflict Resolution. So without further ado, Dr. Tammy Adams, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you, Alyssa, and thanks everyone who showed up today. I'm excited to see folks interested in my favorite environmental law. So I prepared some slides just in case you wanted slides, because I wasn't sure exactly what folks wanted to hear about the National Environmental Policy Act. So I'm going to warn you, this is my first time using Zoom. We're not allowed to use Zoom at my agency, so I'm not exactly up to speed on how to check whether questions are coming in. So I'm going to rely on Alyssa to let me know if folks have questions that I'm missing. Feel free to interrupt me at any point if questions come up, because the slides were really just jumping off point so that I had something to say, something for you to look at besides my face. I'm going to share my screen here. It worked a minute ago, so hopefully it will work this time. Okay. So I know that you know a little bit about how the federal government works and how legislation works, and I'm just going to jump right in. I thought I would do a little bit of a then and now on NEPA, because NEPA has changed a lot in the last few years, really. So starting off, just really how NEPA started. Why did we need a national policy for the environment? If you're familiar with a lot of the legislation for environmental protection, you'll know that a lot of it was passed in the 60s and 70s. That was a time when there was growing public awareness about the environment following really nearly a century of rapid economic expansion and population growth, with industrialization and urbanization leading to impacts from oil spills, chemical discharges, oil pollution, destruction of communities and the environment, just the whole thing. Nationwide infrastructure projects resulted in thousands of miles of crude oil and natural gas pipelines being installed. A federal highway system was built. Multi-state hydroelectric projects were constructed. And by 1967, there had been dozens of bills relating to environmental protection introduced in Congress, but none of them set forth a comprehensive environmental policy. In 1968, Senator Henry Jackson, who was a chairman of the Senate Interior and Insular Affairs Committee at the time, conceived of a national environmental policy. And after seeing previous fights over huge federal works projects, like one of the ones pictured here, the the damming of the Colorado River. He became convinced that the nation needed a way to guarantee that when the federal government went to work with bulldozers, it wouldn't end up doing as much harm as good. And according to one of his biographers, he thought that there needed to be, because there was nothing currently in the federal budgeting or planning process that forced federal agencies to face conflicts of their programs, he thought that there needed to be a national policy. So in introducing an initial report from the Interior Committee to Congress in July of 1968, Senator Jackson said, in the last few years, it has become increasingly clear that soon some president and some Congress must face the inevitable task of deciding whether or not the objective of a quality environment for all Americans is the top priority national goal, which takes precedence over a number of other often competing objectives in natural resource management and the use of the environment. In my opinion, that inevitable time of decision is close upon us. So that sort of kicked off the National Environmental Policy Act. And I know timelines are boring and I'm not going to read the timelines. The point of this slide is that NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, was passed in 1969 and then signed in 1970. And a fun fact is that it passed the Senate without a roll call vote, and then passed just as easily in the House 2 days later on December 22nd. There's some speculation people were in a hurry to leave for Christmas, so maybe they weren't paying as much attention to the details as they ought to have. After NEPA's passage, environmental organizations and concerned citizens didn't waste any time using the federal courts to hold agencies accountable, filing numerous lawsuits that halted federal projects ranging from canals to oil pipelines and atomic power projects. And these lawsuits were filed mainly on the basis that the environmental impact statement required under NEPA was either flawed or non-existent. When President Nixon signed the bill on January 1st, 1970, he was quoted as saying, "It was particularly fitting that my first official act in this new decade is to approve the National Environmental Policy Act. The 1970s must absolutely be the years when America pays its debt to the past by reclaiming the purity of its air, its waters, and our living environment. It is literally now or never." That was 1970. After NEPA was passed, it took nearly 8 years for implementing regulations to be passed by the Council on Environmental Quality, or CEQ, which is an acronym you'll hear me use. NEPA established the Council on Environmental Quality and gave it the authority to pass regulations for implementing the statute. In the interim between the law being passed in 1970 and regulations being issued in 1978, there were a couple of executive orders issued by 2 different presidents, as well as some guidance from CEQ that essentially directed federal agencies on how to apply the law. And also in those intervening years, there was litigation, excuse me, and rulings from federal courts, which further defined the boundaries of how federal agencies should comply with NEPA. The regulations and the statute remained virtually unchanged for nearly 5 decades, with only 2 minor modifications to the regulations taking place between 1970 and 2020. One of them was a minor change, removing a requirement for agencies to consider what was called the worst case scenario. And the second one in 2005 was basically to change an address where documents were to be submitted. Then in 2020, the regulations were substantially revised top to bottom, resulting almost immediately in more litigation. Most of those lawsuits alleged that the regulations were inconsistent with the underlying purpose and policy of the federal statute. So CEQ began almost immediately revising the regulations to address the litigation and other points. And while they've been in the process of doing that for the past couple of years, just recently, the Fiscal Responsibility Act was passed late this summer. And the Fiscal Responsibility Act amended the NEPA statute itself by essentially inserting the 2020 regulations directly into the law. So now, as a result, CEQ is again revising their regulations through the rulemaking process to conform to the revised text of the federal law. And where we stand on that is that the public comment period on a proposed rule ended last month, I think, and a final rule is pending CEQ's analysis of public comments, et cetera, et cetera. But if you want to know what the gist of the new regulations will be, you can take a look at the section of the Fiscal Responsibility Act that amends NEPA, and that'll give you a pretty good clue. So this quote on this slide is from the original 1978 regulations, which the quote itself has been modified in subsequent revisions to the regulations, but I like it, so I'm sharing it with you. And the point of it is that NEPA is an expansive federal law, and it's been called the Magna Carta of our nation's environmental laws. Both the Magna Carta and NEPA espouse ideals of public participation and democracy by giving citizens a voice in government decisions. And much like the Magna Carta was intended to protect people from the dangers of monarchical rule, NEPA's goal is to protect people by providing transparency in federal projects. NEPA paved the way for more than a dozen major federal environmental regulatory programs enacted by Congress over the next 10 years between 1970 and 1980, including the Clean Water Act of 1972, the Marine Mammal Protection Act in 1972, the Endangered Species Act in 1973, and the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act in 1970. That act you might have heard of as the Superfund Act. NEPA itself has been emulated in various degrees by almost half of the United States, which have passed similar laws called SEPAs, State Environmental Policy Acts, or some people call them mini NEPAs. It's also been emulated internationally now by more than 100 countries, so really landmark legislation for its time. So how is it going? How is NEPA going now? Well, since the passage of the law, NEPA implementation has been influenced by public input and litigation. There have been over 5 decades now of case law on everything from whether particular federal actions trigger NEPA to what federal agencies should be considering within the scope of a NEPA analysis. Congress, when they enacted NEPA, purposely did not include enforcement mechanisms in the statute. They also didn't authorize the CEQ or any other agency like the Environmental Protection Agency to enforce NEPA other than through judicial review. So shortly after NEPA was passed, federal courts decided, as a result of lawsuits coming in, that the statute does provide for judicial review of agency compliance with NEPA. And how that happens is through challenges under the Administrative Procedure Act, also known as the APA. The APA allows people to challenge federal government actions, and under the APA, federal agencies are required to have statutory authority to do the thing that they did. So it has to be something that they by law can do, and they have to follow their own rules and regulations in the process of doing those things. So the APA requires federal agencies to document their decision making and show how it was not, quote, arbitrary and capricious. And therefore, to comply with NEPA, agencies have to show their work, basically, through a contemporaneous administrative record. They have to be documenting as they go along the information that they relied upon, the factors that they considered, and the absence of a written record of compliance with NEPA to show that the agency followed the process before taking a final action or making a final decision is basically non-compliance with NEPA. So if you didn't write it down, it didn't happen. One of the most important things to remember in how litigation has shaped NEPA and agency compliance with NEPA is that the P in NEPA stands for policy. Some people think it stands for protection, and it does not. NEPA doesn't protect anything. It's strictly a procedural law. So unlike the ESA, the MMPA, the Magnuson-Stevens Act, some other environmental laws, clean air, clean water, which are substantive laws that set forth standards and things that you can and can't do or must not do, NEPA just requires federal agencies to follow a process. It does not dictate the outcomes or the decisions that they will make. So courts have basically said that federal agencies can use any reasonable factors they determine pertinent to their decision, as long as the environmental information is adequately considered and disclosed. So disclosed, made available to the public. After completing a NEPA review, an agency can implement an action despite environmental costs, as long as it doesn't violate other environmental laws. So they don't have to make the best, most environmentally friendly decision. They just have to show that they considered the effects on the environment in their NEPA review documents. A court's review under the APA extends to whether a NEPA document was, as I said before, arbitrary and capricious, and also an abuse of discretion or otherwise not according to law. Reviewing courts don't substitute their judgment for that of agency experts, so they don't second guess whether it was the right action to take or the right decision to make. But what they will look at is whether the NEPA document contains a reasonably thorough discussion of the significant aspects of the probable environmental consequences. So in NEPA litigation, federal agencies tend to prevail, win against people who are trying to stop a federal action when they have a good written record. When their record is deficient, the courts don't have anything to rule in their favor on, and they lose. So one example of how litigation has played out is back from 1989 in a case related to the U.S. Forest Service issuance of a special use permit for a ski resort in Washington, where the Fish and Wildlife Service prepared an environmental impact statement prior to permit issuance. There was a lawsuit, and then there was an appeal, and it made it all the way to the Supreme Court, which reversed the appellate court's ruling that NEPA requires federal agencies to mitigate harm and evaluate worst case scenarios. So in its ruling, the Supreme Court said NEPA itself does not impose substantive duties mandating particular results, but simply prescribes the necessary process for preventing uninformed rather than unwise agency decision. So in other words, NEPA requires that you show your work, but if at the end of the day you decide to do something unwise, as long as you have it written down, you have not failed to comply with NEPA. So the details of how to comply with NEPA are not just in the action forcing provisions of the statute and the regulations, but also in the definitions of what a federal action is, what the human environment is, and what effects are. So the law and the regulations both contain definition sections, and now the law contains the same definition section as the regulations will, and they provide important context for when and how federal agencies apply NEPA. NEPA compliance is inherently federal. It only applies to actions taken by agencies of the executive branch of the government, excluding the office of the president. So Congress doesn't have to comply with NEPA. The courts don't have to comply with NEPA. Enforcement actions don't have to comply with NEPA. But federal agencies like the Fish and Wildlife Service, the Forest Service, BOEM, all of those agencies are required to comply. So one of the definitions that's key to whether NEPA is triggered by something the federal government does is whether it's a, quote, major federal action. And what that basically means is it's any decision or action taken by a federal agency or involving federal resources, where resources can mean money or equipment or property or staff. So that includes obvious things like federal agencies issuing permits and approvals for infrastructure projects like offshore wind, and also conducting operations like their own research and resource management programs like forestry management, as well as administrative things that you might not think about triggering NEPA, like just managing projects in general programs, adopting strategic plans for how you're going to run your program, and issuing regulations that could impact either commercial or public sectors. So even things that don't take place in the environment, that take place, in an office, somebody sitting at a desk with a computer, those can be considered federal actions that trigger NEPA compliance. And the thing about the environment in NEPA is that it's broader and more comprehensive than the parts of the environment that are required to be considered in a lot of the other laws. So, for example, the Clean Air Act focuses on air emissions, and the Clean Water Act focuses on water discharge, and the Endangered Species Act focuses on the species that are listed as threatened or endangered and their designated critical habitat. But in NEPA, the environment that has to be considered is inclusive of the natural environment, meaning the physical and biological resources that are present, as well as the social and cultural interrelationships of humans with the natural and built environment. So it's a much more comprehensive look at the environment. And then the bigger part of any environmental review is how effects must be considered. And it's in terms of what resources are present and how the federal action may affect them. So it's context and intensity. And effects under NEPA can be both short and long term. They can be direct, meaning they occur at the same time and in the same place as the federal action. They can also be indirect, meaning they take place later in time or at some distance. So think about downstream effects of a discharge. There's a point source where the discharge enters a waterway, but the affected environment is as far downstream as the effects of that discharge would travel. And cumulative impacts are key to a NEPA analysis, where cumulative impacts are defined as things that were past, present, or reasonably foreseeable impacts on a resource, regardless of which federal agency or non-federal agency caused them. This is the hardest part of a NEPA analysis. It's where a lot of federal agencies fall down and where a lot of litigation takes place. I'm just going to quickly say there are 3 levels of NEPA review. There's an environmental impact statement, or EIS, an environmental assessment, also known as an EA, and a categorical exclusion, which, depending on which federal agency you're interacting with, will be abbreviated as a CE, a CX, or a CATX. Originally, only one, the EIS, was defined and required by the statute. And the other 2, the EA and the CE, were streamlining measures that were introduced by regulations so that agencies had a way to explain why their action didn't require an EIS to comply with NEPA. Because remember, if you didn't write it down, it didn't happen. And the only document that the statute originally called for was this full environmental impact statement, which requires agencies to consider alternatives and discuss and describe the environment and the effects of all the alternatives on the environment and go through a public review and comment period. So there are 2 stepped down levels. There's the EA, which is for things that are not likely to have significant effects on the environment. So you probably don't need an EIS, but you do need to write down why an EIS is not required. And then there's a group of things that are normally do not have significant effects. And these are called categorical exclusions. Every federal agency has to develop its own list of categorically excluded activities. They're usually for routine actions that are common to most federal agencies. So every federal agency has a handful of things for administrative, property management, personnel management, keeping the lights on, buying the office supplies type federal actions that don't require an EIS. And then they're also specific to agency missions and goals. So things that are commonly and frequently undertaken by the agency's experts following the agency's own best practices, like issuance of certain types of permits by permitting agencies where there's no environmental effect due to the nature of the permit and the requirements of the statute under which the permit is issued, or where the effects of the action are constrained by another environmental statute, such as the Marine Mammal Protection Act or the Endangered Species Act. Those have guideposts on them to prevent activities that are taken under those statutes from having significant adverse effects on components of the environment. So NEPA reviews generally have these 5 parts, with the exception of a CE, which I'll get to in a second. So NEPA reviews generally, regardless of whether they're for a really complex infrastructure project or a fairly straightforward small scale rulemaking, generally start by detailing what the proposed action is. And the proposed action statement in an EA, an EIS, or a CE document will say, name of the federal agency wants to do a thing. And the thing is, build a bridge, issue a permit, promulgate regulations, award a grant. And that's the proposed federal action. That's the thing they want to do. Then there's supposed to be a purpose of and need for the action statement in both an EA and an EIS. You won't see it in a categorical exclusion, and I'll explain why in a second. That purpose and need statement is the heart of the NEPA document in terms of complying with the spirit of the law. The purpose and need, so the proposed action is the thing the agency wants to do. Like I said, build a bridge, issue regulations. But the purpose and need is the goal the agency is trying to achieve and the reason that they need to do anything at all. So a properly defined purpose and need statement in an EA or an EIS allows the agency to consider a quote unquote reasonable range of alternatives that allow the agency to meet its goal while having differing types or levels or degrees of effects on the environment. So this is the bookends that you should see in an environmental impact statement. You don't see this particular part in a categorical exclusion document because the agency has already decided that that class of activity has no potential to affect the environment, so they're not required to consider alternatives to that proposed action. But you will see in all levels of NEPA review a brief description of the affected environment, meaning what resources are present and what is their status. Are they listed as endangered? Are they protected under some other statute like the National Historic Preservation Act, essential fish habitat under the Magnuson-Stevens Act, wild and scenic rivers, prime farmland, all of those other environmental laws. And then there will be an effects of the proposed action and the alternatives to that proposed action. And that's the heart of the NEPA review. How will the proposed action or its alternatives affect every resource? What is the interaction of those effects? What are the cumulative effects of adding this project to all of the things that are already there affecting the resource and that quote unquote reasonably foreseeable thing? And reasonably foreseeable is a little tricky. It doesn't require agencies to have a crystal ball. It just requires them to take a reasoned look at what they know is happening. So if they have other permits in front of them at the time that they're writing an EIS for a particular permit, they're not supposed to put their blinders on and pretend they don't know about those other permits. The NEPA statute itself encourages using an interdisciplinary approach and cooperative planning in the review. By law and by regulation, the lead federal agency, which is the one in charge of or otherwise the main proponent of a federal action, is supposed to identify all the affected interests and parties and make diligent efforts to inform and involve them. Part of this process includes identifying what other laws for protection of the environment may be triggered by implementing the federal action. And generally, permitting and consulting agencies would be considered cooperating agencies with jurisdiction by law. And other agencies, other federal agencies, state agencies, local agencies, tribal nations may have special expertise relative to specific resources within the project action area that could be affected by the proposed action or its alternatives. And lastly, of all of the groups of people that are involved in the NEPA process, last but not least, informing and involving the public is a key component of the NEPA review process. The requirements for when and how federal agencies are required to engage with the public vary by the level of NEPA review documents. So by regulation, there are required public comment periods for EIS, for a draft EIS and a final EIS. There's a required notification and review of the public when an agency establishes its categorical exclusions. All NEPA documents, whether they're a memorandum documenting use of a categorical exclusion or an environmental assessment or an environmental impact statement, they are all public documents. They are all supposed to be made available to the public. And a little bit about those other laws. The NEPA process is intended to help federal decision makers identify when or whether other environmental laws may be triggered, including requirements for consultations and permits or authorizations. So this all comes down to strategic planning. Not only do you identify all of the laws, but you may be able to identify alternatives that don't trigger a requirement for a permit or a consultation, because you could avoid a sensitive life history stage for a resource or a sensitive location by moving your project a few miles upstream or downstream, or left of the island, right of the island kind of thing. So in this way, NEPA is substantially different from other environmental laws. As I said, it requires federal agencies to follow a process, but it doesn't dictate outcomes. It's often referred to as an umbrella law because it can facilitate integrated compliance across a multitude of federal, state, and local laws, just a few of which are listed here. And just anecdotally, a lot of these federal laws for protection of the environment were enacted in the 60s and 70s or majorly revised during that time, subsequent to NEPA being passed. When NEPA is applied as an early planning tool, when it's used as it was intended for federal agencies to take that holistic, comprehensive look at what they're doing to the environment and coordinate with all the other agencies that might have a role, it helps facilitate compliance with other laws by identifying the different scopes, timelines, thresholds, requirements for public involvement. It allows for producing integrated documents that can satisfy requirements of more than one law. So instead of having to do compliance sequentially with multiple separate documents, agencies can write a single document that gets processed in parallel for compliance with multiple laws. So it really is, it's intended to be a planning tool, not an obstacle. And as I've mentioned once or twice, it doesn't dictate what decision a federal agency has to make. So it's not saying issue the permit or don't issue the permit. It's just saying show your work. And I'm going to quickly touch on, because litigation has been such a big part of how NEPA is seen today, how it's used, how it's evolved, how federal agencies have evolved their compliance programs over the decades. I'm going to talk quickly, just this one slide about litigation. So when NEPA is violated, people can bring, like I said, lawsuits under the Administrative Procedure Act. The most common reasons for that the public has for bringing suit is failure to produce a NEPA document. There's no memo that says we use the categorical exclusion. There's no environmental assessment. There's no environmental impact statement. It may be that there was no significant environmental effect, but if the agency didn't document what level of NEPA review was applicable, then they just didn't comply with NEPA and they lose. The other way is if they have a NEPA document that's deficient in one of the ways listed here. So they can get dinged for not considering a reasonable range of alternatives. This is often a fatal flaw resulting from a bad purpose and need statement. They maybe overlooked an important resource or an effect on a resource. Maybe there was a very important study that they neglected to consider in their impacts analysis. Or they've proposed mitigation measures that a proponent of the action would say are not actually going to be effective at mitigating effects to the degree or in the manner that the agency is proposing that they would. And when that happens, when those documents are brought in front of the court and the court rules in favor of the plaintiffs, the people who are opposing the federal agency's NEPA review, the court can do a number of things. They can reverse and remand with or without instructions to vacate. They can enjoin, they can issue an injunction. They can issue what's called a declaratory judgment, basically. And they can, blanking on the legal term, but they can order the government to fulfill their official duties or correct an abuse of their discretion. So basically all of these things are saying, stop what you're doing and fix your NEPA. And the court can retain control over the agency's production of that NEPA document if it wants to. It can set a schedule. It can require drafts to be provided. And throughout all of this process, if there was an injunction or the court vacated like a permit or something, the federal action is not taking place. So when federal agencies try to rush the NEPA or cut corners on the NEPA and they end up in court, they haven't done themselves any favors. So this is my last slide. I have some backup slides in the weeds if you have some more questions after that. But I want to end by just posing, so we know NEPA is now in this stage of revision. And with the Fiscal Responsibility Acts that happened to NEPA and the pending CEQ regulations that go along with them, there will inevitably be a new era of litigation related to interpretation and application of the law. At the same time, there are more and more major infrastructure projects being proposed and funded to meet the needs of a growing population in a changing environment. There's offshore wind proposed here, there, and everywhere. There are aquaculture projects being proposed in open ocean waters. There are new species of marine life being listed as endangered, new marine protected areas being listed. That the environment is not static, and NEPA does not take place in a vacuum. There are numerous other laws related to the environment that constrain or direct the actions of federal agencies. So much as NEPA has become a scapegoat and a whipping boy for project delays, it's not a permitting statute. It's not the statute that agencies actually use to let projects go forward. It's a planning tool. There are logistical considerations for all of these projects that people might want to take that can slow down a process, including availability of raw materials. We've all seen this happen during COVID. Things weren't getting shipped, things weren't getting produced. There can be labor shortages. There are a whole multitude of things that can influence a project that has federal involvement making it across the finish line. NEPA compliance is just one thing in that whole process. And the environment itself is rapidly changing. We've got, melting ice caps, coastal inundation, droughts, and wildfires, and all of these things which make planning for and executing projects more challenging. Where do you site this thing knowing that sea level rise is going to be a factor? Or that you're not going to be able to get water if you're talking about being out west in the Colorado River Basin. So it remains to be seen how this new era of NEPA compliance and implementation will fulfill the original intent of a comprehensive national policy to, quote, encourage productive and enjoyable harmony between man and his environment. I'm reading from the purpose of the law. Promote efforts which will prevent or eliminate damage to the environment and biosphere, stimulate the health and welfare of man, and enrich the understanding of the ecological systems and natural resources important to the nation. So that's the end of my slides, unless you want me to jump into the weeds and show you the verbatim text from the statute, which I can if you want, but I'm going to pause there and see if there are questions.
Thank you. That was really great. For all of our viewers, the Q&A is open. Feel free to put any questions in the Q&A function. I think it should be at the bottom of your screen. You can only the host and panelists will see this, and you can make it anonymous if you don't want it attributed to you specifically. So any questions are welcome. But I will go ahead and kick it off with a question from Tacey, who is my partner with TAMP. So it's a two-parter. How often are compliance rules and regulations modified, and what is the process for incorporating new research findings?
So how compliance rules and regulations, do you mean NEPA regulations or regulations under other laws?
I think she means NEPA regulations.
So NEPA regulations stood unchanged from 1978 until 2020 with those two minor modifications. So nearly 4 decades of these regulations are working for us. They were overhauled top to bottom during the previous administration. I'm not going to get into the politics of that. You can go read headlines from the time, but because NEPA is part of a process that is it's because it's procedural, it's low-hanging fruit. So it has become the scapegoat, like I said, for all of the calls for permitting reform. So the regulations were revised in 2020, and then they were revised again a little bit, just small changes in what CEQ called phase 1 changes a year later. And then CEQ was in the process of making some bigger phase 2 changes that would address the litigation and some other things when the Fiscal Responsibility Act was signed in July, and now they have to go back to the drawing board. And what was part 2 of the question?
It was. What is the process for incorporating new research findings?
So there aren't any substantive research findings underpinning the NEPA regulations because it's procedural. So unlike the Endangered Species Act, where when a new species is listed, the agency has to present things like this is the status of the population and this is the modeling that we've used to determine why it's endangered and why critical habitat is needed, et cetera, et cetera. None of that comes into play with NEPA. It's focused on the big changes to the regulations are focused on putting page and time limits on how long an agency can take to write its document, when and how the public can get involved, um, how many alternatives need to be considered, and things like that. So it's all about basically streamlining the compliance process.
Great, thank you. We have a question on how does NEPA address environmental justice and diverse stakeholder engagement? So I know you talked about how important it is to get that community input. So I'll let you discuss.
Sure, that's a great question. There is a requirement in NEPA to look at, as I said, the interaction of social and cultural factors and economic factors with the natural, the physical, and biological environment. And typically, so I'll just give you an example. When an agency uses a categorical exclusion and they say, hey, we don't need to write an EIS for this because we've done it so many times, we know it doesn't affect the environment. They have to look at what's called an extraordinary circumstance, where they document whether taking that action will have a disproportionate adverse effect on minority communities. And when you scale that up to an EA or an EIS, they're again required to look at, if we cite this pipeline through this small town versus this rich part of a big city, are there disproportionate adverse effects on minorities or low income communities? And those minority and low income communities, those are defined by federal agencies that monitor those. So there's maps and there's places that federal agencies have to go and look. And they're also required to inform and engage those communities that would be impacted, including, like I said, tribal nations and state and local governments, so that they can have input. Because a federal agency is not going to be an expert in every location, right? So they should be consulting the people on the ground. And that's, I don't know if that entirely answers your question, but yes, it is a requirement that environmental justice considerations be part of the NEPA review.
Awesome, thank you. Would you mind sharing any advice for anyone in the science, policy, or communication-based areas? Any advice for anyone in those areas who may be seeking a job in this, I know it's a very broad area, but this area that you're in?
Well, if you're looking for a job with the federal government versus private sector, there's kind of two different strategies there, right? So I'll talk first about the federal government. The federal hiring process is crazy. But the key to getting on the certification list is what it's called. When all of the applications come through, they get ranked. And the ones that rank a certain amount make what's called a certification list or a cert. And those people are the candidates that are called for an interview. The key there is when you read the vacancy announcement for the federal job, you have to, most agencies are using USA Jobs, so it's a question and answer format that you have to fill out, as opposed to giving your nicely formatted curriculum vitae or resume. Use the words from the vacancy announcement over and over again in your application. And because I like, true story, I know someone who didn't make a certification list because it was required that they had 12 hours of coursework in a field of botany, and the people reviewing their application didn't recognize the course title as having to do with plants. So they like just so that's really the key there. Outside of that, though, I would say it's partly connections, right? Like there are people who do this through nonprofit organizations, and that's actually how I started right after graduate school. I had a position with a nonprofit organization that they're one of the organizations that sue the place that I currently work for noncompliance with environmental laws. Um, the Sea Grant program itself is actually a great funnel into environmental policy and science places. And then there's an organization, I'm not a member right now, but there's an organization called the National Association of Environmental Professionals. This is not a plug for them, I just know of them. But they hold meetings, sort of like, the Marine Mammal Society has meetings and the American Fisheries Society has meetings. And it's, in theory, it would be a place to make connections, learn more about opportunities. So I don't know if that's a helpful answer, but that's the best I can do.
Yeah, very helpful. What are some of the biggest challenges in ensuring compliance with NEPA from a scientific perspective?
I would say it's uncertainty and non-science people not understanding that science doesn't deal in absolutes, which is the case with policy and science in any realm, in any field, in any law. If you're a scientist, you know that we tend to be cagey about how we talk about the results of a study. The results suggest, the study suggests, right? We're not dealing in black and whites and absolutes. Whereas policymakers and politicians want absolutes, they want black and white. And so I think communicating the degree of certainty that is acceptable to a scientist, the reasonableness, the certainty in a policy context is the most complicated part of it.
So NEPA has been called an ocean conservation success story. How would you say NEPA has changed the landscape of ocean conservation?
I think probably there's been some landmark case law, which I won't be able to name any of them off the top of my head. I'm not a lawyer. I'm a scientist by training. Um, it it's given the public an avenue for being informed and involved. It's sometimes things like a lot of these offshore. I'm just using offshore wind because it's so much in the news. And I don't work on it for my agency, so I'm not in no means an agency expert on offshore wind. But you see somebody wants to put a wind farm because we need more energy, right? More people means we need more energy, and wind is there's wind everywhere. People may not hear about a project until there's a NEPA lawsuit, right? They might not know that something is about to take place in their backyard. And also, I think it's probably been successful because it does require um, to be done right, it does require this interdisciplinary approach and this cooperation and coordination with all of the affected parties.
Great. And I have one more question for you. And again, the Q&A is open for all of our viewers. So if you have anything, just pop something in there. But you touched on this briefly, but can you go into sort of the future directions of NEPA a little bit more?
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure where NEPA is going to go, except I think it is going to go directly to court with the new regulations. Because, like I said, there's been 50 years from 1970 to 2020 case law, case after case after case, where the courts rule over and over again: if you didn't show your work, you lose. And they've refined what a quote unquote hard look under the statute means, and what is considered reasonable as a range of alternative, and what is considered a connected action, right? So you can't break up a big pipeline into little bitty bite-sized pieces and go, oh, this little piece of the pipeline is not going to affect the environment. So that's the case law that stood up until 2020. Now we've got these new regulations, so the future of NEPA is up in the air. I think people who thought that changing NEPA with these new regulations and the Fiscal Responsibility Act, we're going to make permitting projects go faster, are going to find that they're just getting into court faster. Because it's a brave new world. Nobody really knows what the courts are going to say.
Great. Well, I have no new questions, But if you have any concluding remarks, we can take that now.
I think I would like to say thank you for inviting me to do this. Like I said at the beginning, I love talking about NEPA. It's my favorite environmental law because it specifically requires agencies to engage with the public and take that, interdisciplinary and comprehensive approach. I have enjoyed working with it. I hope that the future of NEPA um, continues to take us in the direction that the people who passed the law in 1968 intended, which was to build a better environment, to protect the environment for future generations, because goodness knows we need a law to help us do that.
Yes, agreed. Thank you so much for being here. I learned a ton. And thank you all for joining us today and learning a little bit more. I'm sure you all took back some valuable information. Again, yeah, thank you, Dr. Tammy Adams, for being here and taking the time out of your day to speak with us.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
Our next webinar will be Tuesday, November 21st, where we will have Pradeep Singh from the Research Institute for Sustainability talking about deep sea mining and the International Seabed Authority. And this will be as he's just coming back from the most recent ISA meeting. So it should be pretty interesting. And I hope to see you all there.